Hello and welcome to Faded Instruments. Today I'd like to show you our new instrument, Blumen und Pflanzen. It's an FM noise machine that kind of specializes in these blown out, distorted, pulsating rhythms. It's quite simple, but it's quite expressive. It's a really interesting one. And it's primarily built as a kind of performance tool. We have two oscillators which are pulsating at different tempos. They each have their own kind of clock to generate these kind of rhythms or polyrhythms. Though if you want to, you can actually also control it by MIDI and have it synchronized to the tempo of your track. To begin with, let's take a look at what the interface is like. It can be divided up into three sections, either vertically if you want or horizontally. I guess first let's take a look at it vertically. In our top section, we have our kind of XY control center. In our middle section, we have our more like sound design panel. And in our bottom section, we have our effects. We've got a distortion and a delay here. If you want to look at it horizontally from left to right, you can see on our left-hand side we have oscillator number 1. In our central section, we have the kind of global controls, and then on our right-hand section, we have oscillator number 2. To get started here, just hit this play button right in the very center. And the noise begins. Simplify the sound a little bit. When you simplify here, you can tell we have two oscillators that are pulsating. We have volume controls for each of these oscillators and separate start and stop buttons. So at the moment, we're just playing oscillator number 1. And you can see our controls here. We have a kind of master pitch control. We have a waveform shaper, so we can go from sine into square with pulse width control. We have a knob here which controls whether it's FM or PM modulation. And then we have our pluck section, which this is essentially a frequency sweep. So you can change how high the starting point is of the frequency and then how fast it goes to our pitch that we've set here. So where this instrument gets a little bit more interesting is in its kind of envelope and speed control. This XY pad controls the attack and decay envelope. And you can see we have going up and down, changes the decay amount, going left to right, changes the attack time. And what's interesting here is that the speed of the pulsations are dependent on the envelope. So the attack plus the decay equals the speed of the oscillation, of the pulsation, I'm sorry. So it creates this really interesting relationship between the shape of the sound and the speed of the sound. So that's oscillator number 1. Oscillator 2, I'll get started here, is identical. And this itself is simple enough. It's somewhat interesting, but where it starts to get more interesting is that this is an FM synthesizer. And what you can do is through this FM matrix XY pad here, you can choose how much of oscillator 1 to send to FM modulate oscillator 2 and vice versa. So by just raising it, you can hear one of the oscillators is FM modulating the other. And here, it's the opposite. And then everywhere else in between, it starts to create a feedback loop. So 1 is sending to 2, 2 is sending to 1, and so on. And you create these pretty interesting and distorted sounds. You can change the FM type, FM PM, however you want it. They're pretty similar. And last but not least in this area, you have your kind of master speed. And this just speeds up all of the attacks and decays and speeds and whatnot. So we, of course, have a distortion effect here with cutoff resonance, LFO, and we have a delay. So this is all interesting enough, but if, for instance, you don't like the way that the sequencer works, you can actually sequence this straight in Ableton. So if you notice here, you have these two buttons that say sequence because we are in sequencer mode at the moment, but you can switch this over to Midi mode just by clicking these buttons. You'll notice we don't hear anything more, and that's because we haven't actually sequenced the MIDI yet. This tells us right here that this is MIDI note C3 in Ableton, and this is MIDI note C#3. So if I were to create a loop here, start sequencing, we would have let's just put an extra one in there. Let's get the delay off. And ultimately what it's is behaving like right now is a 2-channel drum machine. But what's interesting here is that each drum sound is dependent on the other drum sound because they're FM modulating each other. So it's interesting. And of course we have independent controls, so you can choose one to be in sequence mode and one to be in MIDI mode. And that's Blumen und Pflanzen.